Oh, that's live. Thanks, Caleb. Well, good morning, everybody. It's so good to see you all here in the middle of August when so many people are somewhere else. Thank you for coming. It means a lot to me and to this place and to this whole community that we come together to meditate and to explore together the wisdom of the Buddha and all the wisdom that has unfolded because of the seeds that Buddha planted over 2,500 years ago. This morning, I think the gain might be a little high. Okay. This morning, you probably didn't see the title of this talk because I actually was very late in getting it out there, so it wasn't in the newsletter. But I decided to call it Devotion. I bet it's not what you think. There's some things in Buddhism that are pretty interesting, and sometimes our understandings get out of kilter with what the Buddha actually taught. And so I thought devotion, I don't know about for you, it's a big word in Buddhism. But it turns out that here in the West, it doesn't actually mean the same thing as what it means in the East. I mean, we take, Sanskrit, Pali, Tibetan words, and we do our best to translate them into English. But I think meanings need to be discussed because, when I first came to Buddhism, I heard of the importance of devotion. Yeah. I thought I knew what that was, and it was something like a Motown song, If you feel like giving me a lifetime of devotion, I second that emotion. You know that one? Anyways, great song. I don't sing it well. And that was kind of my concept, was some form of being in love. Turns out that doesn't work. The further you get into the Dharma and meditation, that kind of thing doesn't work because pretty much from the beginning, we're starting to work with recognizing our thoughts and recognizing that we have the incredible superpower of letting thoughts go, including thoughts like, that are thoughts that are particularly connected to our preferences. I like this, I love this, I hate that, I don't want that, And we let them go in order to experience this open, luminous space in our minds. And then within that, what we call the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, unfold and bring us to a state of some realization of reality to the point that we begin to feel more at home in our universe, and we feel a little more open so we can allow the universe, just as it is, to feel at home in us. So this talk is going to be a little bit about that, and it's going to be based on a little bit of a teaching by Mingyur Dorje Rinpoche, who's one of the great lamas in the Karma Kagyu tradition, this tradition. And also teachings on the Kalama Sutra, which was spoken by the Buddha and recorded by the monks sitting around him. And the commentary on that by a Theravadan monk named Bhikkhu Bodhi. So I want to give attribution ahead of time in case I forget during the talk. And that way you know where this is coming from. But before we start, let's start the way we usually start, with the refuge prayer. We say the refuge prayer 3 times generally, and I do want to do it that way, usually because it's an invitation first to allow it to kind of manifest in our world, to recognize that refuge is right here. So I'd like to say it the first time in English so that our minds can wrap around what the words are, okay? And little by little, if you say it over time, your mind will start to get some depth of meaning from each of the words. That just happens naturally over time. Don't force anything. And then we'll chant it twice in Tibetan, because the first time is all about kind of getting our minds around it. And the second time is about kind of opening up this atmosphere of refuge, of love and compassion within ourselves. And the tune helps that. And then the third time is just resting in it, and just resting in the feeling of it, so that the tune helps with that too. So we'll say it the first time in English, and the second and third time we'll chant it in Tibetan. And once again, I apologize ahead of time for my voice, which isn't going to take me to America's Got Talent. So, in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the assembly most excellent, I take refuge until I reach enlightenment. By the merit of generosity and other good deeds, may I achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. Sanje churang soki chognam la, Jangchu pardu dagni kyapsuji, dagi junsoki pe sunam ki, drola pinshir sanje druparshok. Sanje chudam soki chognam la, Jangchu pardu dagni kyapsuji, dagi jinso yipe sunam ki, drola pinshir sanje drupa sho. So, devotion. When I first started practicing meditation, it was a long time ago, and it wasn't in the Buddhist tradition. It was actually in a yogic tradition, and the Swami that I was learning from talked about devotion, and he said, well, you just got to be a little in love with me. And okay, so that fit with my Motown idea of what devotion was all about. That worked. And the problem was that it's kind of like a blind faith. And eventually, it took a long time, because there was a lot for me to do in meditation before my mind felt like it was tame in the least. But eventually it did. And I realized that, okay, that's it. I've finally calmed down. I mean, it took 20 years, but I'm finally calmed down a little bit. And it felt like there was a dead end, because this sense of motivating energy that, at least in the Buddhist tradition, devotion is supposed to be, just wasn't there. And I felt like I wasn't growing anymore and felt stagnant. I used the analogy that I was in a box canyon. That wasn't, I don't mean to paint that as a bad thing. Actually, that's what drove me to seek out this place. It was back in the 90s, so it's been a while. And so, that sense of still needing to grow overcame this sense of Motown devotion that I had. And one of the early teachings I got that was amplified a little later on, when I first met Mingyur Rinpoche, was devotion's a little different than what I thought. The first form of devotion is curiosity. He said, just being curious enough to pursue something, that's devotion. So let's say, using a very Buddhist analogy, you're not well. You're sick. And rather than just kind of lay in it, you begin to want to learn a little bit about it. And so you start to read a little bit about how you're feeling and why you might be feeling that way. That curiosity actually has the early components of devotion in it, all right? Because it drives you to learn. And eventually, it may take you to a doctor who actually knows what they're looking at. They've been there, they've done that, they've studied this. They actually have some methodology that could possibly help you. And so you go to the doctor and you are really honest with them. This is the thing. Big thing is honesty. One thing, if you ever get an individual interview with a lama or a meditation instructor or something, if you want to get the good of it, be just breathtakingly honest about where you're at, because they may not be able to read your mind. In fact, I virtually guarantee they're not clairvoyant, none of us. And so the more you can help them with whatever your symptoms are, the more they can begin to understand where you are, what the obstacles and obscurations and troubles might be, and where they might be, stemming from. So when we think about devotion, we're thinking about first our curiosity about our situation, and then next, we think about devotion as actually taking steps to investigate. Now, in the traditional Buddhist, one of the Buddhist analogies is the Buddha is the physician, okay? Among the founders of this particular lineage is a fella named Gampopa. And Gampopa was known as the great physician, interestingly enough. But the thing is you go to the doctor, and then they prescribe the medicine. What the Buddha prescribes is Dharma. And then you take the medicine, and it may require some adjustments, and it may require some tweaks here and there, so you got to keep in touch with the doctor, right? And eventually you get the medicine just right, and you take the medicine, and all of a sudden, you start feeling better. When you start feeling better, there's a natural gratitude that comes, right? It's just a natural gratitude that arises for the physician. And in that gratitude is what is meant in Buddhism by devotion. And that can spill over in a lot of ways, including wanting to support a place like this, where others might also encounter the physician and the medicine and so forth. And that's how we begin to think about devotion for the three jewels. Three jewels being Buddha, the physician, Dharma, the medicine, and Sangha, the gathering of the people who are involved with this healing process that brings compassion and kindness into the world. So what devotion means here is having a love for love, a love for compassion, a desire, a profound desire to support love and compassion and how it grows in this world. So just think about that in your day. I was sitting in my living room preparing this talk, and I've got this plant. I love this plant. I bought it at a Costco a couple, 3-4 years ago. It's called a ginseng ficus. It looks like it's got aerial roots that look like whole ginseng roots and then kind of fig leaves coming out of it in a wild sort of a way. It got very unhappy about a year ago, and I realized that this pot I had it in was probably a little too small and it wasn't draining very well. So I became essentially, the plant called out to me with kind of being droopy and some of the leaves turning yellow, was talking to me, was really honest that it wasn't feeling well. And so I started, I'm not much of a Buddha, but maybe I can be a Buddha for my house plant. I'm kind of at that level. So I figured out, okay, I'm going to get some really good soil. And figure out what that is, that it would really like, or what kind of environment would help it feel healthy again. And so I repotted it and all of that. And then, of course, in the process of repotting it, I pulled it out and the roots had all kinds of clumps of dirt like attached to them. And I don't know much, but I figured if drainage is a problem, clay around the roots couldn't be a good thing. Nutrients weren't going to get in there, so I had to try to break some, carefully as I could, break some of that clay off of the roots. No doubt I damaged some of the roots while I was doing it, but I repotted it, and then it looked still unhappy. Beautiful new pot, I must say. Got it at Oakland Nursery, great. But it looked very unhappy for about 2 or 3 weeks, and I just kept talking to it and looking at it and doing my best to not water it too much and not water it too little, and it just started looking a little healthier, looking a little bit healthier just in the last couple days, finally. Probably those roots I damaged are starting to heal, is what I figure, I don't know. Well, if you can imagine, our lives probably are much more complex and have many more obstacles than just clay around the roots, although I know we all have like stories, backstories, and there's all kinds of stuff. But what the Buddha was able to do was to understand where people were and what they were asking him for, and addressing that so they could get started from right where they were and begin to grow in a healthy kind of way. That's how the whole movement grew, and that's why it sustained itself for so long, because it's true, it isn't primarily about being devoted to some doctrine, but at the same time, it is about being devoted to the Dharma. So that's the tension. That's what I wanted to explore this morning. So here's the thing. You will recognize this probably. If not, you'll find it on the internet. There's a quote that floats around, supposedly a quote, that the Buddha said, "Do not believe anything because it is said by an authority, or if it is said to come from angels or from gods or from inspired source. Believe it only if you have explored it in your own heart and mind and body and found it to be true. Work out your own path through diligence." It's close. It's not really exactly right. So I wanted to look at that because it didn't seem quite right. It didn't fit with this whole thing that I just told you about. And yet, it's out there. Part of it fits. So that's when I started investigating this. And that quote sort of is an exposition of something that's said in the Kalama Sutra, which has often been described as the Buddha's charter of free inquiry. And it does counter a lot of the degrees of dogmatism of his time and continues to, challenge dogmatic thinking right up until now, which is very attractive to some of us in the West about Buddhism, is that, we realize we can have a spiritual path that's authentic, that's not bound by something, like hidebound beliefs that are unbelievable. So, the problem with it is, though, we're unenlightened people. We're people who are coming here because we're not 100% well. So if we're applying all our own preferences, what we like and what we dislike, to whatever truth or spiritual prescription is being given to us, we're likely to get it wrong. Beyond that even, a lot of our thoughts are negative thoughts. It's all about, if in an untamed mind, it's all about, I want to get what I want and I want to avoid what I don't want. And anything that challenges any of that, I don't care about that. Well, those, from a Buddhist point of view, what the Buddha taught are actually the three poisons. Our suffering grows out of that. So how do we get it both ways? That was my question. Here's what Bhikkhu Bodhi said. The Buddha is made out, when you look at that quote out of context, as being a pragmatic empiricist who dismisses all doctrine and faith, and whose Dharma is simply a free thinker's kit to truth, which invites each one to accept and reject whatever he likes. Wow. And he goes on. But the Kalama Sutta, Theravadins call the sutras suttas, and Mahayana is called the suttas sutras. You decide what you want to call it. But quoting Bhikkhu Bodhi, he says, but does the Kalama Sutta really justify such views, or do we meet in these claims just another set of variations on that egregious old tendency to interpret the Dhamma according to whatever notions we like? So the passage that's often quoted or misquoted, here's what it actually says. Come Kalamas, that's the name of the people he was talking to. Do not go upon what has been acquired by repeated hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon scripture, nor upon surmise, nor upon axiom, nor upon specious reasoning, nor upon bias towards a notion pondered over, nor upon another's seeming ability nor upon the consideration that the monk is our teacher. When you yourselves know these things are bad, blamable, censured by the wise, undertaken and observed, these things lead to harm and ill, abandon them. You can see that in the original quote, there was a misquote. They leave that part out, right? And when you yourselves know, they leave this part out too. These things are good, blameless, praised by the wise, undertaken and observed. These things lead to benefit and happiness. Enter into them and abide them. So he's saying, don't have blind faith in stuff, but look at what brings about suffering and stop doing that. And look at what brings about goodness and happiness and do more of that and check it out with what he calls the wise. And the wise, what are the wise? It's important to understand what the wise are. Well, when you see somebody who's an exemplar of who you want to be when you grow up, that's a good indication that they're what's known as the wise. So a big public example of that is maybe His Holiness Dalai Lama. Pretty much whatever you see, wherever you see him, he somehow on the one hand can cut through so much human confusion, and in his wake what he leaves behind him is people who are at peace, people who are happy. He himself, even though he's had an extremely difficult life. I mean, when you read about his life, it's unimaginable that he could even be alive, let alone carry the burden of what he carries. And yet, he's full of love and compassion and joy all the time. Okay, so that's the wise. That's who I want to be when I grow up too. Because life's not easy, and that's how I want to be, that's how I want to respond to it. Bhikkhu Bodhi points out that like everything else spoken by the Buddha, it has a specific context. That's why they tell you what people he's talking to. The particular audience and situation in this sutta, the Kalamas, are citizens of the town of Kesaputta. And that particular town had been visited by various religious teachers of divergent views, each of whom propounded his own doctrines. And part of the deal was, back in those days, no TV back then, so entertainment was listening to people fight with each other, all kind, about stuff. So they would listen to religious people of divergent views, and each of them would propound their own doctrines and tear down the doctrines of their predecessors. The problem was this left the Kalamas perplexed, and thus, when the recluse known as Gautama, that's the guy we call Buddha now, I love that. In the sutta, he's the recluse called Gautama, reputed to be an awakened one, arrived in their township. They approached him in hope that he might be able to dispel their confusion. From the subsequent development of the sutta, it is clear that the issues that perplexed them were things that actually people ask questions around here at the question mics all the time. There are questions about the reality of rebirth and karmic retribution for good and evil deeds, basic stuff that comes up. So what does the Buddha do? This is interesting. They're real honest about what they're confused over and not embarrassed that they don't get it. That's the first step. It's like, we're confused, we don't get it. That's really a good start with a teacher. The Buddha begins by assuring the Kalamas that under such circumstances, it's proper for them to have doubt and encourages free inquiry. He next speaks the passage quoted above, advising the Kalamas to abandon those things they know for themselves to be bad, and to undertake those things they know for themselves to be good. Now, this advice can be dangerous if given to those whose ethical sense is underdeveloped. We see this all the time. All right? So if you haven't figured out what's good and what's bad, if you don't have a core, a root that's healthy in morality and in ethics, this is not good advice, all right? So this isn't like the advice you want to give somebody who's used to stirring up trouble, used to telling lies, used to doing that. That's another sutra to study, not this one. This is for people like, I would imagine, are here, like us. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have a kind of strong sense of morality, of ethics, of knowing what's good and bad in your life. You just don't show up in Dharma centers unless you feel like that. Usually people come here, and I'll just speak for myself, because you do have a sense that there is something in this life that's good, and yet it's confusing that it's not all good, and I feel a little confused and a little bad, and you want to feel better and are hoping that that Buddha's a good physician, the Dharma's good medicine, and so forth. So this advice was for the Kalamas who were kind of in that position. I hope you can identify it. If not, well, just take it with a grain of salt, because this is for certain people in a certain context. So we can assume that the Kalamas are people of refined moral sensitivity. But he didn't leave them wholly on their own resources by questioning them. He led them to see that greed, hate, and delusion, the three poisons, were the root causes and harm of suffering for themselves and for others, and are to be abandoned, and their opposites, being beneficial to all, are to be developed. The Buddha next explains, so it's weird, he doesn't just stop with this prescription, he starts asking them questions to the point where they see for themselves that greed, hate, and delusion are the problem here. And so then he explains next, the noble disciple, devoid of covetousness and ill will, undiluted, dwells pervading the world with boundless loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity. Thus purified of hate and malice, he enjoys life here and now. Reference like the Dalai Lama. There you go. That's a good description of who he is. Then he goes on, though, because he's still answering their questions. If there is an afterlife, he didn't even assert that there was one to them. If there is, and if there is karmic result, then he will undergo a pleasant rebirth. While if there is none, it's possible there isn't any of that, he still lives happily now, because these are the causes of happiness. If evil results befall an evildoer, then no evil will befall him. And if evil results do not befall an evildoer, then he is purified anyway. So if you can practice, loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity, it's all good, It's like It's all good. With this, the Kalamas expressed their appreciation of the Buddha, and then they took refuge in the Triple Gem. That's an important thing, actually. So because they hadn't even taken refuge yet, they weren't Buddhists, okay? So, if that's the way it's written, we've got to ask ourselves, does the sutra suggest that a follower of the Buddhist path can dispense with faith and doctrine and make their own personal experience the criterion for judging the Buddha's utterances and for rejecting what cannot be squared with it? While it's true, the Buddha does not ask the Kalamas to accept anything he says out of confidence in the Buddha. We have to note that at the beginning of this discourse, they weren't the Buddha's disciples. They approached him merely as a counselor who might help dispel their doubts. But they did not come to him as a Tathagata, which is another name for Buddha, which means truth finder, who must show them the way to spiritual progress and final liberation. So, it wasn't until after this, some of them took refuge. He didn't even teach them what things that we talk about all the time, like the Four Noble Truths, which was the Buddha's first teaching. He didn't mention that. He taught them how to inquire in themselves and discern what was helpful towards happiness and what was not. For those that at that point realizing that he actually was a good doctor and took refuge in the doctor and in the medicine, then he could start to talk about the Four Noble Truths. And at that point, now we have something that we can be devoted to in the Buddhist understanding of devotion, because it is the medicine that we need in order to bring about happiness and the legitimate expectation that we can grow up and be Buddhists too, like the Dalai Lama. Does that all follow? Does that make sense? So it's appropriate, actually, to recognize and share with somebody that we're checking out to be our doctor, where we're at, what mental corruption that we're dealing with, in some honesty, and then begin working on it with what has been like set of prescriptions that have worked for 2,500 years. The questions about life after death and karma and all that just fall into place. You see that or you don't see that in a lifetime, doesn't matter. Once you're really focused on the essential things. So, we're focused on what we feel our defilements, our problems, our obstacles are. What's the primary bondage? What's the imprisonment? What's the suffering? So that we can get started in dismantling it by using these tools that the Dharma provides But we have to come to that on our own. So that's where that really subtle point comes in. No, it's not just all about your own experience, and yet it is. You've got to bring your own experience and then apply the Dharma to it. That's the point. And then, once we begin to develop this sense of equanimity and kindness and wisdom, we can check them against teachers, the wise. So I wanted to put a pitch in here. 2 weeks from now, there's a High Lama, not a famous Lama, but an extremely high Lama coming here to Columbus. And he'll be doing like a Friday night public talk, and then 4 different sessions of Dharma teaching on morning and afternoon, Saturday and Sunday, and something called an empowerment. Do you guys know what an empowerment is? Some of you do, some of you don't. And I would recommend that you want to come and be exposed to that. These are rare events, obviously. This guy is what's called the Lopan, or the Vajra Master, at Trangu Monastery in Nepal. And what that means is that his practice is powerful and profound. And when you're a Vajra Master, that means you can give empowerments. And what that means is, so there are all these like tankas and stuff up here, and statues, rupas. They're just representations of different forms of our own Buddha nature, what's already in there. But we don't see ourselves that way. He's gotten so far along the path in his practice that he actually can embody the energy and the qualities of a Buddha within the context of these special ceremonies called empowerments. And then by being in the room and part of that ritual, you can catch a glimpse of your own Buddha nature as well. That's what's getting empowered, is your own ability to see the Buddha nature in yourself. So in order to take a particular empowerment, it's just extraordinarily beneficial to your Dharma practice, and I would recommend that you do that. Usually the empowerments are about particular bodhisattvas or Buddhas. I heard that he's going to be giving the empowerment of Vajrasattva. Vajrasattva is the Buddha purification. And people who practice what we call the preliminaries, or nundro, actually do that practice quite a lot, because it's very effective in clearing up these obstacles and hindrances we have from seeing our own Buddha nature and our own connection to everything and everything's connection to us. So in support of those people who are practicing Vajrasattva and Nundro, he's going to do that. But really and truly, even if that's not your practice, it will be of extraordinary benefit if you come and become part of that empowerment practice. So, what's at the root of all this is that we all have minds. They all have preferences. We all have things we like and things we don't like. We all have some level of ability to have insight and to question things. And we also all have the ability to let go of all that and experience the mind's openness and its luminous nature and its limitlessness, within which a deeper nature, a Buddha nature, can bubble back up. So in the Kalama Sutra, what the Buddha is doing is saying, okay, let's work with what you brought me. Let's work with your preferences. Let's work directly with what you already know to be good and bad, and bring you to the point where you're ready to step into the world of kindness and compassion, joy, and equanimity. Now, what we do in this center is that we encourage everybody to believe and to know directly that even as beginners, we can catch a glimpse of this bare awareness where we find ourselves more at home in the universe and find the universe as being more at home in us. And we do this through a practice called shamatha. So I want to do a quick shamatha practice to end this talk. Just so that we can experience together the baseline from which all this kind of emerges. It's a natural thing. It's as natural as feeling wonderful watching a beautiful sunrise or sunset. So sit up straight. And just follow your breath in and out. Let your awareness completely inhabit your breath. Until it becomes calm and tranquil. See your thoughts as children simply playing in the playground. You don't have to engage with them. They just come and they play, they go. And externally, become aware of the breath leaving your body and going out into space. So that you feel your mind in this sense of expansion. The same breath expanding limitlessly in space, touching you at the cellular level, every cell in your body. Complete openness. complete connectedness. And then ask yourself this question. I wonder what my next thought will be. Then watch your mind for what happens. I wonder what my next thought will be. And then watch. When you experience the gap, just openness, rest, completely relaxed. And now from that state of mind, from that point of view, let's dedicate the merit of understanding ourselves, studying the Buddha's words, the medicine a little bit, and understanding our own mind as having the potential to be Buddha. And we dedicate the merit of that. Just say it one time in English. And then after dedicating the merit, there'll be a few minutes left for questions or comments if you have any. By this merit, may all attain omniscience. May it defeat the enemy, wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death. From the ocean of samsara, may I free all beings. The courageous Manjushri, who knows everything just as it is. Samantabhadra, who also knows in the same way. And all the bodhisattvas, that I may follow their path. I completely dedicate all this virtue. Good morning.
Is this thing on? There we go. Thank you for your talk today. I feel like in your discussion, you talked about sort of what devotion isn't, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what in Buddhism, what devotion should look like, particularly for beginning students. Does that make sense?
Sure. Well, I think I think devotion, even in hindsight, you could even see your confusion or pain that drives you to be curious about alternatives could be like the seed of devotion. So once you begin, for beginning students, you even want to regard your own difficulties with some reverence. And then certainly you want to appreciate your own curiosity that drives you to start to explore and regard that with some reverence. And then once you meet something, so when you say beginning student, I usually think of that as somebody who has begun to practice and begun to study. So for a beginning student, the appreciation, the gratitude of the gratitude for the instructions kind of embodies devotion. So this sense of thankfulness, when the historical Buddha was first achieved awakening, the story goes, he didn't feel like he had words for it. And he was just going to be a forest monk, and that was going to be it. And, probably pray assiduously that other people would discover the same thing, but he didn't know what to say. And then the story goes that the gods, Brahma and Vishnu and so forth, Indra, I think, was the third one, begged him because they recognized that he had awakened. They begged him to give teachings. And then he taught the Four Noble Truths. So from that point on, that attracted some attention from first yogis in the forest and then other people who are connected to them. And the teachings have been passed down really carefully. Through written things, through, more importantly, word of mouth things from master to disciple, for over 2,500 years. And now it's here for you. I don't know about you, but when I think about it in that context, my gratitude is pretty overwhelming. There are a lot of wisdom traditions. We can know this in the age of the internet. There are a lot of wisdom traditions that actually the lineages have been broken because of wars, famines, megalomaniacs, all kinds of reasons. And once the lineage is broken and the oral tradition, the energy of the teachings can no longer be passed down from master to disciple, you can read the written word, but the same thing as we began with today gets in the way, right? We're left with our own unenlightened interpretations of these written words, and they don't get us anywhere. We end up in those box canyons and dead ends because they're limited by our own limitations. So this gratitude, when you really think about how these teachings came to you as a person, to me is like the root of devotion. It's just kind of an overwhelming gratitude. And then you see some people, I'm an ordinary householder and I've got a family and a job and all that stuff. There are some people who leave all that behind just to learn everything, just so they can pass it on in an authentic way. and benefit. Literally, this idea of praying to be able to benefit beings is a living reality for them. That's one of the things about Lama Topten, who's going to be here in a couple of weeks. It's one of the things about him. He's one of these people that has just left everything behind in order to embody the teachings as best he can. And there's real power in that. So you can have devotion in the sense, it's almost like a sense of awe, because he literally did that for you. He did it for me. It's like, holy moly. And so it's kind of like devotion doesn't come just because he also may say some things, in fact, likely will, that'll challenge you, maybe even piss you off. Strictly because it's not coming from your own kind of preferences. It's coming from this place up the road a few miles from where we are, and he's saying, no, you really have to, there's a pothole going in that way that you fall in and you won't be able to get out. You do have to go this way, then that way, and that, to get around it, to get here, you know. The point is he's there. And so there's some devotion for the directions that he gives too, and you want to follow the directions, the prescription as best you can. Does that make sense? It's like that. And then when it works, and this is the cool thing about Buddhism anyway, it's been working for over 2,500 years for all kinds of humans in all kinds of cultures all over the world. So it's likely to be able to work for you too. And that's the cool thing. And when it works, there's this natural, like, wow. And there's a certain devotion, but it's not that Motown kind of devotion. It's like a profound appreciation and respect. So, anyway, it's a good question, though. Thank you. I think I want to say one more thing about that. I read one of these psychology papers recently where they wire people up, you know, and they do the scans of the brains and all that kind of thing. This wasn't particularly a meditation one. This was much more basic. And they wired people up to measure what their brains were doing whenever they had to say yes or whenever they had to say no. And it turns out that our minds have a lot easier time saying yes than no. Saying no is hard, takes more energy. Saying yes is easy. So, if you are in a crowd or watching a TV show or exposed to a lot of hateful, negative stuff, your mind is going to say yes to it because the mind's always going to do the easiest thing. And you'll probably feel good about that because your mind is totally saying yes to it. This is how real negative things get going and get embedded in culture. That's why they were studying it. By the same token, if you're around a group of people or doing a meditation and say like this empowerment that I was talking about, and you get somebody who's so skillful they can give you an experience of your own enlightened nature, your mind's going to say yes to that too. So by practicing the Dharma again and again, practicing this prescription, our mind says yes to that. And we keep saying yes to kindness and compassion, and joy and equanimity and our own Buddha nature, and it becomes a kind of reinforcing loop that helps us grow up to be who it is that we want to be when we grow up. So we end up having devotion for those things our mind can say yes to that actually are the causes for happiness, which goes back into the body of the sutra, where the Buddha, just through asking questions, kind of helped people identify, okay, what are the causes of happiness in your life? Well, let's do more of that, because your mind's automatically going to say yes to that a lot. And let's abandon the stuff that are causing difficulty and misfortune, because your mind's going to say yes to that too. You literally have to recognize it and let that go, you know? And so you can even have devotion to your own path based on that. And kind of, I mean, for me, it's kind of like, I'm not a big game player in video games. I don't basically do it. I'm old, you know. Old people don't do that. But there's a game in that, you know. So when experiences pop up, I can put the whammy on that thing and just kind of go in that direction. It's kind of fun. So you can even have devotion, literally devotion for the game of it. So, does that make sense? Thank you. Well, I'm already 7 minutes over time. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your being here and your attention. It's good to see you all.